Thank you very much for the introduction. So I was going to open this talk, The Memory is the Life and Work of Theresa Hak Kyung Cha, by first surveying the audience. How many of you have heard of Theresa Cha kind of like prior to this talk? Raise your hand if you've heard of her. Okay, so we will all be learning about her portfolio as an artist together in this talk. She is a very interesting figure, and she is quite foundational, I believe, to a new generation, specifically of Asian American poetry. Many contemporary poets working right now, such as Ocean Vuong, Myung-Mi Kim, Kathy Park Hong, and Dong-Min Choi, all cite Theresa Cha as a major inspiration for their work. So by getting to know her better, you can also get to know the specific literary tradition a little bit better as well. So let's first begin by looking at who is Theresa Hak Kyung Cha, some basic information. So she is an experimental visual and performance artist. She does a little bit of everything, and we are going to get into that as the talk progresses. She is born in Busan, South Korea in 1951, and she dies in New York in 1982. And you may be thinking, oh, her life is kind of short. We will get more into her death later. It's quite influential to the reception of her work and how Cha has been portrayed after the fact. She is best known for her experimental text, Dictée. Some people call this a novel. I would say it's kind of a combination of prose and poetry. Dictée is now a major canonical text in the field of Asian American literature. So if you take an Asian American literature survey or you're interested in this topic, you are going to run into Dictée at some point. What is Dictée about? The best way to summarize this text is that it is a series of narratives, each organized into one chapter. There are 9 chapters, each named for a different Greek muse, and each chapter kind of covers one of Cha's sort of major concerns as an artist, particularly in terms of Korean history and feminism. That's a brief summary of Dictée, but we'll get more into that later. And Cha is a highly multilingual artist. So here I list that she works in English, Korean, and French primarily, but she also knows a little bit of Latin and Greek, and this is also important to fully understanding her portfolio as well. Going to Cha's background, so her family is quite interesting, and I think without the specific family background that Cha has, we don't get this very kind of like daring experimental artist that we have with Theresa Hak Kyung Cha. So she is the middle child of 5 siblings. Their names are John, Elizabeth, James, and Bernadette. Of these siblings, Elizabeth is the only one who is not some kind of artist or creative in her own right. John is a writer, James is a photographer, and Bernadette is an actor. And all of the Cha siblings had a very kind of collaborative role in helping Cha make her pieces. So there's always a whole family behind Cha, particularly in her early work. She works together with them quite frequently, and I think that's important to mention that she's not kind of a singular genius in a sense. A lot of her pieces are influenced by her family, and they help contribute to her deep portfolio that we have, even though she worked only for a short period of time. Both of her parents, Cha Hyung-soon and Cha Hyung-sang, were school teachers. They were born in Manchuria, so kind of like north of North Korea. They worked there, and then they fled to South Korea, and then from South Korea to America, so they have kind of a tough refugee life, you could say. And both of her parents, because they're teachers, really value education. And we also see that in Cha's career as well. She got 4 degrees from UC Berkeley. Her parents supporting her is a large part of that. Her parents are also creatives as well, influencing their children's trajectory. Her mother, Hyung-soon, aspired to be a writer, and we'll get more to that later. And her dad, Hyung-sang, aspired to be a painter, and both of them are big influences in Cha's work as well. They both contribute to her first book, Dictée. One other fun fact worth noting about Cha's background is that she is a niece of the children's book writer Kang Sok-chung, who she is related to on her mother's side. He is best known for writing children's poetry during the colonial period, so just a fun fact about her background. Moving to her early life, like I mentioned earlier, her parents are from Manchuria, and the Korean War really left her family in a very precarious position. They're moving from one place to another. They don't live in the same city for very long, and eventually, due to the political unrest in Korea, Hyung-soon Cha, along with Cha's eldest brother John, eventually immigrate from South Korea to Hawaii in 1961, and the rest of the family follows in 1963. So Cha's childhood is pretty unstable. She's moving from place to place. Not only that, but she's naturally a pretty quiet kid, and she's moving to a bunch of different places where she doesn't necessarily speak the language, and this experience was very influential in terms of her later artistic interests. Cha develops a lifelong interest in the process of language, how we learn language, how language shapes our identity, due to many of her early childhood experiences and those of her parents as well, as they were moving from place to place, and both were forced to speak Japanese under the colonial occupation. So in 1964, the Chas moved from Hawaii to the Bay Area. Theresa Cha is about age 12 at this time. And she eventually has a very formative experience attending a Catholic school called Convent of the Sacred Heart High School. And it is at this school that she learns French, Latin, and Greek, so a very multilingual education. She's not only learning English, she's learning these 3 other languages as well, and her time in high school is deeply influential to her artistic portfolio. She brings up a lot of themes that she learns in high school throughout her work, and this is most evident in Dictée, which uses not only French, but also has many references to Roman Catholicism and its practices, in part influenced by her time at this high school. So that is a little bit on Cha's early life. Moving forward to her career, Cha was at UC Berkeley for a very long time. The family's in the Bay Area. It's a natural fit. And she gets multiple degrees there. She gets a degree in comparative literature in 1973, a degree in art in 1975, an MA in art in 1977, and an MFA in 1978. So she spends a really long time in school. She has a lot of time to experiment with what kind of artistic approach she wants to take, and she has a lot of time to try all kinds of different things. So while she's at Berkeley, she is not only making short films, she is also doing performance art. She also has a stint where she's interested in textile or fabrics. She is also interested in ceramics at one point, and she also is interested in becoming a writer. So what we can kind of see here from Cha's career is that she is very much still trying to figure out an approach, or has a lot of different interests that she's trying to unite all at once while she is at Berkeley and shortly afterward. Cha also studies abroad in Paris in 1976, and this is very formative to her career. It is here in Paris that she gets to spend a lot of time with French intellectuals that are interested in film theory. We will learn more about that later. And this is where Cha gets a lot of these influences, particularly as it pertains to psychoanalytic theory, which is one of her major academic interests that we can see in her career. Cha, after attending school for a very long time, moves to New York City in 1980. And she publishes an anthology of film theory called Apparatus, 2 poetic pieces, Exilée and Temps Morts, that are featured in her friend's anthology, Hotel. So she's really just beginning to kick off her professional career right at this point in time. In 1982, she publishes Dictée, her first book, and then a week after she publishes Dictée, she is raped and murdered in the Puck building in New York City. And her death is important to mention because her death has actually very much colored the reception of her work, how kind of we read Cha's work, especially because Dictée features many young women who are martyred in some way, shape, size, or form. And it's important to kind of be aware of the circumstances of her death and not let that kind of blindly color our reading of the work. Obviously, it wasn't intentional, but some people have kind of read it as such. So it's good to be kind of careful around that particular topic. Moving to her artistic influences and style. So her professor at Berkeley, Bertrand Augst, who she worked a lot with, she collaborated with him for Apparatus, said in an interview that Cha always did something creative, never any formal written analysis. So Cha's work is very academically rigorous, it's very theoretically rigorous, and we'll see that she's quite meticulous about planning out her pieces in this presentation, but at the same time, she's not very keen on writing a formal paper. She often chooses to express herself in kind of a more creative or experimental way. And one thing that is very unique about Theresa Cha is that she's extremely plastic when it comes to her stylistic influences and what she puts in her work. This is just a short sampling of things that she's interested in, but pretty much anything that Cha did or was exposed to could kind of meander its way into her work. So that includes kind of the conceptual art she was studying in school, the film theory she learned in school, a lot of French writers, Catholic practices. She did Tai Chi as a hobby. This also makes its way into her work. And one of her favorite authors is Samuel Beckett. His style is also very evident from her work. Anything she was exposed to could find its way in there. She describes her practice as looking for the roots of language before it is born on the tips of the tongue. So again, thinking back to Cha's childhood, where she learns a lot of languages, she moves countries. This is something that I think is reflective of that experience growing up and how she has kind of unstable identity through her language. Therefore, we kind of see this in her work, and she's interested in exploring this topic. She also describes her artistic practice as a form of alchemy, in a sense, and she writes about the artist as a sort of medium, an alchemist of sorts, that tries to find a set of collective associations to inspire transformation in the audience. So one thing that is important to infer from this practice is that Cha's work is always inherently collaborative. Cha is presenting one thing that she hopes can kind of unlock a sort of set of associations in the audience's memory. The audience is crucial to completing the meaning of Cha's work. One other interesting outcome of this is that it suggests that Cha's work doesn't really have one correct interpretation or set of meanings. It is open to partial readings, misreadings, etc. Whatever perspective that the audience comes from and makes of her work, that's acceptable to Cha as long as they are kind of actively engaging with her piece. So I think this is important to note because her works are very evocative and open up a number of avenues for the audience to find a connection with, especially considering her many diverse interests across a variety of fields. Some recurring themes in her work are chronology, language, history, colonization, and memory. So I think a lot of these are fairly straightforward, but regarding chronology, one particular thing that interests Cha is kind of like the subjective experience of the passing of time. So there is kind of the objective experience of time, right? When you look at a clock, you tell the time. But what Cha is interested in is how time seems to pass differently for different groups of people. And this is very much influenced by her family history and by the Japanese colonization of Korea and kind of subsequent chaos after the Korean War. So for Cha, living in America, she notices that not a lot of people are aware of what happened during the Japanese colonization in Korea. For her, it is a sort of forgotten chapter in the history of Korea that not many people are aware of. When writing about her family's experiences for a short film titled White Dust in Mongolia, she discusses her family's experiences and likens them already to ancient history. It is already forgotten, and it is necessary that the history of the Korean people be forgotten in order to enable their colonization, right? Because people who are living in the past are ones that we don't need to be concerned about. Only certain groups of people get to advance to the future, and this kind of logical premise is necessary for this process of colonization and displacement. So for Cha, she's very interested in how to expand or condense time, especially through grammar in her works, or through making people wait in her performance pieces, and that's kind of how this sort of abstract concern plays out materially in her texts. The other things all follow suit from this. Memory especially, Cha is really into psychoanalytic theory again, so kind of the idea that there is a collective unconsciousness that everyone can kind of tap into. Her works seek to help people think about the unconscious, kind of tap into the unconscious, etc. So all of these concerns are related in a way, and we'll see them recur throughout her pieces today. And that is just a little bit on her style. So moving forward, this is a male piece by Cha called Audience Distant Relative that I think best problematizes this idea that the audience is always a collaborator in Cha's work. So you can see here, she writes, "You are the audience, you are my distant audience, I address you as I would a distant relative. Neither you nor I are visible to each other. I can only assume that you can hear me, I can only hope that you can hear me." So this piece references that maybe the connection that Cha tries to make with her audience is unsuccessful. It's a difficult connection to make. It's difficult for the audience to always kind of pick up on what she's thinking, but nevertheless, she's going to try it anyway, right? And the format of this piece, it being a male piece, also reflects the distance between Cha and her intended audience, right? When you send someone a letter, it is not an immediate, there's a temporal gap between the writer of the letter and the recipient, and there is also a spatial gap between them as well, right? And the letter is the medium that kind of helps to bridge this gap. So Cha is kind of playing off that format in this particular piece. So they're all connected together. And here is a sample of her artist statement, and you can see the main body of my work is with language, so this is where she says that, and then she talks about her work a little bit in this piece as well. Moving forward, this is a small sampling of some of Cha's pieces that she made, and I have included this here to show you the wide range of mediums that Cha is working with. And from her earlier pieces, before her stuff that she writes in the 1950s, I will go over two of them that I think best represent certain themes that appear in her final work, Dictée. But this is just a small sampling of stuff that she did so you can understand how diverse her portfolio is really. We see here in this ceramic piece from 1973, she's working with ceramic. We can see here she's working with textile in the Word from 1975. Cha is very fond of wordplay, so taking just any regular word and then kind of deconstructing it, reconstructing it to see multiple meanings that can come from one word that we might otherwise take for granted. It's really kind of emphasizing a sort of slowness of interpretation, making you really kind of think about what does this word truly mean. We see that tendency here with the Word 1975. We see in 1978 she's made this stamp mokash, so she is really doing a lot of different materials in her artistic portfolio. So the first piece that I will go over in more detail is called Pomegranate Offering. It was made in 1975, and like the Word, it is a textile piece. It's a linen booklet, and this piece kind of alludes to, in a sort of roundabout way, a myth called the Homeric Hymn to Demeter, which is the Western classical myth about Demeter and Persephone, the one where Persephone is kidnapped by Hades and Demeter has to go on this quest to get her back. And this is a recurring myth kind of throughout Cha's portfolio, you could say, and it is also based upon the subsequent festival in ancient times, the Eleusinian Mysteries. So this was a big festival where everyone would kind of gather and reenact the Homeric Hymn to Demeter, and the structure of the Mysteries was very much based around seeing and unseeing, like who sees the true meaning of the festival, who has already experienced this festival versus first-time initiates who hadn't experienced the festival yet. And the whole point of the festival is that it tells you how to kind of deal with death in the afterlife. So there's a lot of religious significance around this festival, and the metaphors of kind of veiling and unveiling are something that Cha really picks up on in this piece. I would say that Pomegranate Offering, in terms of thinking about the body of her work, reflects an early interest in kind of collective memory through mythology, right? Because this is kind of a common thing that a lot of people share. It's a way to access a sort of collective memory within a certain space. And it also reflects her interest kind of in religion generally that we see throughout her portfolio. So looking at Pomegranate Offering, we see the title here, that this text is read. I should also mention it's Pomegranate Offering, likely because Persephone eats one thing when she's in the underworld, it's a pomegranate, so that's how we can make this connection. We can see that she is doing her kind of signature wordplay here. She's signaling the beginning of the text. We can see her interest kind of in dragging out this process of religious devotion, right? So she is doing some wordplay here, and we can kind of vaguely read distortion, distance. So she's kind of playing off these words in order to kind of exaggerate their meaning or let the audience form their own conclusions. And here we see this section where she's playing on veil, avail, reveal, arrive, so making all of these associations kind of based on constructing and subsequently deconstructing the same word over and over again, playing on that thematization of sight with revelation, kind of very deeply implicated in the ancient festival, the Eleusinian Mysteries, which is also kind of connected to this myth that she's interested in. So we can see how she uses this wordplay to make this reference and then make the audience also kind of think about how we can create different meanings just from one simple word, right? Deconstructing it, really making you kind of think about how she arrives at that conclusion, you could say. And these are the last sections of Pomegranate Offering. So we can see the lifting and lowering, maybe referring to Persephone's kind of journey in and out of the underworld, etc. And unfortunately, I would like to read the small text here, but the scan on the Berkeley archives is not quite good enough to read this text. So I don't know what it says, but I am sure it is very interesting. So moving forward to her next piece, I am covering another piece from 1975. It's called Able Whale. You may think, is there a typo in this PowerPoint? Why is A separated from bull? That is how Cha chose to format it. So again, going back to her interest in language, wordplay, you can see that she will kind of even do this sort of thing with the titles of her pieces. So again, she's a performance artist. This is one of her performance pieces that has gained a lot of attention. And the way that Able Whale worked was that viewers would watch Cha from behind a cheesecloth curtain. And behind this curtain, she has a little performance area that is surrounded by candles and mirrors. So it's very much creating this dreamy, meditative setting where you're not kind of fully sure what is going on. The performance is divided into sections that feature motion. So Cha kind of meticulously blocked all of the motion that she would do in Able Whale versus still sections. So the audience is just kind of watching her as she moves about or chooses to stay still. And she additionally intersperses the motion and stillness with sound and silence. So some sections of Able Whale are completely silent, and some sections of Able Whale are quite noisy. And to make the sound in Able Whale, Cha had a combination of items. She had glasses full of water with wet rims. She would rub the rims of the glass to kind of create a sort of haunting sound. She had wooden percussion instruments, and she also had sheets of fabric that she would tear intermittently throughout the performance. So the space is very kind of meditative and it's echoing. This piece also featured Cha in an all-white costume that is very reminiscent kind of what a shaman would wear, sort of referencing this practice of Korean shamanism, which is again kind of another religious practice that allows the audience to access a sort of collective memory, right? So kind of in line with pomegranate offering, she's playing off of a religious or mythological tradition in order to kind of facilitate this sort of artistic alchemy that she sought to undertake in her pieces. And she writes that in Able Whale, she wished to be the dream of the audience. So again, really emphasizing that kind of connection between her and the audience and the collaboration she hopes to facilitate by providing a sort of dreamlike environment that is very different kind of from a normal everyday one where she has kind of full control over what the viewer is doing. So, looking at this piece, we can see this is her little write-up here, and these are photographs taken of Cha from behind the cheesecloth curtain. So you can see the curtain here, you can see all the candles in this photograph, and you can see that she has a little white headband on and a white robe. She also apparently had 20 feet of red and black fabric also underneath this robe, so this is kind of a strenuous piece for Cha in a way. She's wearing quite a lot of linen to make this piece happen. We can see she is doing her motion here in this section of Able Whale. And here is some of Cha's characteristic wordplay we can see with this piece, so kind of similar to how she is dissecting words in Pomegranate Offering. We see this here with her notes for Able Whale. And here are Cha's notes on how to block this piece. So you can see that she has stage directions up here, so this isn't all random. She has it very much like planned out, and you can see her intended motions throughout the piece, this little stick figure and the kind of circle of the performance area that she has here. So moving forward, our next piece that Cha worked on is Apparatus, published in 1980. And this is Cha's anthology of film theory. So again, this is less stuff Cha has written herself and more a collection of writings that she is personally very interested in. And this collection very much reflects the time she spends in France. The text draws from a number of French psychoanalytic theorists and film theorists such as Christian Metz, Jean-Louis Baudry, and Roland Barthes. And what Cha means by apparatus is a very specific one. So in this piece, she sought to theorize something she dubbed the cinematic apparatus, which she describes as the interdependent operations comprising the film, the author of this film, and the spectator. So this is operating on a very similar axis as her desire to act as a sort of alchemist in her work. facilitating a connection between herself and the viewers, kind of based on certain artistic elements she draws out. It also harkens to her kind of collaborative approach, where she wants the audience to be able to kind of decide the final meaning of the piece. All of these pieces that she has selected for inclusion in the apparatus kind of deal with the topic of how to make a film in such a way that it can kind of connect with the audience in this mode, etc. One other interesting point about Apparatus is that it features unnumbered and unlabeled literary excerpts that all pertain to doubling, knowledge, and sight. In particular, she's very interested in cave imagery throughout the literary excerpts in Apparatus, so maybe hearkening to watching a film in a dark room. She is kind of playing off of this in this piece. Apparatus really demonstrates how Cha seeks to create a sort of receptive space through print. So this is something that she's able to do in a piece like Able Whale, right? Where she's able to kind of control the setting that the audience perceives her in, and she kind of remakes the setting in a sense in Apparatus, especially through the literary excerpts that are literally printed with white ink on black paper, literally enveloping the audience kind of in a darker space sort of behind the curtain. And there is one original piece from Cha in Apparatus. It's called Commentaire. So again, alluding to her interest in French, and it's a little bit cheeky thinking about commentaire. It's a comment or a commentary, right? So this is Cha's anthology on film theory. You could say it's her commentary to film theory. She has this sort of self-referential piece in here as well. Looking at Apparatus, this is one of the literary excerpts from Apparatus. This is Plato's Allegory of the Cave. So a very famous bit from ancient literature where Plato argues that, oh, you know, some people don't understand reality. They are in a cave watching kind of stick figures playing out, and they think that's reality when it's not. So she's kind of alluding to this in her piece. A lot of resonance with the process of watching a film, so on and so forth. And these are some sections from Commentaire in Apparatus. So these pages are side by side. So she's playing with deconstructing the word again, right? And also with color especially, the kind of contrast between the black text on the white page, the white text on the black page, etc. So kind of, again, creating this sort of meditative setting in her work. And here is the way that she blocked out Commentaire for inclusion in Apparatus. So again, showing her process is very meticulous. She has this planned out in a lot of detail. And you can see the credits for the photographs even that she uses in Commentaire in Apparatus. One other important piece that Cha makes in the 80s is a film called White Dust from Mongolia. It's given a date of 1980, but you could say the process of this film is more like 1979 to 1981. She spends a lot of time doing this. This was supposed to be Cha's first big break. White Dust from Mongolia was intended to be a 100-minute movie. She got $18,000 in funding to make this movie, which during the 80s is a lot of money, so a lot of people are interested in the success of White Dust from Mongolia, right? And the movie is deeply concerned with the Japanese colonization of Korea and kind of the subsequent diaspora from that. So again, thinking back to Cha's family concerns, there's a bit of a personal element to White Dust from Mongolia that maybe isn't always as evident from some of her earlier pieces. She wanted to make something that was kind of close to their heart. White Dust from Mongolia features two distinct yet overlapping narratives that are a little bit abstract in theory. So the first narrative of White Dust in Mongolia is in what is considered to be past time in the movie. There is a kind of unknown female protagonist who has amnesia, and she gradually relearns her language and identity. It is very strongly implied that this protagonist is a Korean person who has kind of suffered with the war or the effects of the colonization, but it's not necessarily explicit. And in the movie's present time, a second kind of unknown female character helps the first character kind of return to the past and regain her memories. And I think in a way that both characters represent some of Cha's own personal concerns, right? So that first character represents this idea of Cha moving away from Korea, kind of forgetting things about Korea, being separated physically from Korea, the place where she was born, and having a lot of alienation from that. And in present time, this kind of second character almost acts as Cha in a way, right? This sort of alchemist or artist who wants to collaborate with another party and help them kind of access their collective memory or their unconsciousness. So both characters kind of reflect herself in a way, and it is also believed that White Dust from Mongolia was the first time that Cha was able to go back to Korea since she had left. She got funding to make the film, and she intended to shoot the whole thing in Korea. However, during this time period, Korea was under martial law thanks to the assassination of Park Chung-hee, so the filming did not go as planned for Cha and her brother James, who was there on support for the film. They were mistaken for North Korean spies, they weren't able to get the footage that they wanted, and they were forced to abandon the project in its filmic version. And this is something that is very devastating for Cha, and she kind of continues to rework on White Dust from Mongolia in a variety of ways. She kind of never gives up the narratives that she initially planned for this piece. She first tries to make it into a book, as we can see here. So after attempting to shoot White Dust from a movie and that not really going well for Cha, she intended to write it as a book and has sort of a statement on how she would write it as a book. So the plot of the book is very similar to the plot of the movie. Again, it's really interested in these concerns of sort of the collective memory and the passage of time. However, there is one caveat, and that is that the protagonist is given a very specific identity marker that is lacking in the film version of White Dust from Mongolia. So the protagonist of the book version is specifically a Korean by birth, but living in China, so a Korean woman who is essentially living in Manchuria, and this very much resonates with Cha's own mother, Hyung-soon Cha, and we can see that this figure, Hyung-soon Cha, her own mother, is very important in this stage of her work, and she is very much kind of building upon her experiences, sort of collaborating with her in order to make her pieces happen. And I would argue that the general concepts of both the book version of White Dust from Mongolia and the film version of White Dust from Mongolia are repurposed ultimately in Dictée, which features an entire chapter in which Cha's mother, Hyung-soon Cha, is kind of like a protagonist, and also features a lot of emphasis on Korean history, the colonization of Korea, and kind of the subsequent diaspora that results from that historical phenomenon. So here's an excerpt from the screenplay of White Dust in Mongolia. So you can see this first narrative where she has her amnesia character, and then we see this excerpt here, and the wording of this excerpt is quite similar to her writing style that she adopts in Dictée and some of her other written pieces. So you can see there is some influence there. These are the excerpts from her storyboards. You can see, as with all of her pieces, she's very meticulous about how she plans this out. She has a very kind of specific vision for the way this was intended to be filmed. And then we have some film stills from the footage they were able to capture. So I think a lot of these are in Korea. There are some stills that are from Japan, but I think most of these are from Korea. And we can see the railroad here, which is going to be an important image. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, particularly as it pertains to Hyung-soon Cha, Cha's mother's writing. And here we have a photo of a wall. So the next pieces that Cha published are Exilée, Temps Morts, also given a date of 1980. So 1980 is just a very generative year for Cha. She's doing all kinds of things. She has published a lot during this time period. So these are two poetic pieces that are published in Hotel, an anthology by Cha's friend Rhys Williams, by Tonnen Press, which is also the press that published Dictée. Exilée was initially a kind of museum installation, so there are slides associated with it. Exilée is like a whole kind of sensory experience. You walk in, there are slides, there's text, etc. And it is very much likely that Exilée was written prior to White Dust from Mongolia. So while Cha is kind of having this mini identity crisis of sorts, of, oh, I really want to go back to Korea, I kind of want to see what happened there. And Temps Morts, on the other hand, is likely composed after Cha's kind of unsuccessful filming of White Dust from Mongolia. So she went back to Korea, but it wasn't what she expected. She's a little bit disillusioned, and Temps Morts really kind of works with that sort of disillusionment. She expected everything to kind of be the same as it was, but when she went there, came back, it wasn't. She's a little bit disoriented. So both of these pieces are very much interested in the passage of time. So for Cha, time is not really passing in Korea in the same way that it's passing for her in the US. She kind of thinks everything is the same, but it's not, etc. It is also very much focused, again, on these recurring concerns of memory and language. So in both of these pieces, as usual, she's kind of like deconstructing words or has a very grammatically unusual style that really makes you think about the structure of the sentence in English or French, and also this kind of idea of collective memory keeps recurring in these pieces. And again, like White Dust from Mongolia, I believe that influences from Exilée and Temps Morts also ultimately appear in Dictée. So she's kind of really combining everything together that she's doing in the early 80s that ultimately results in what we have now as Dictée. So these are some selections from Exilée. You can see she is literally kind of deconstructing grammar here, present passive, modified sentences, making you really think about kind of the construction of grammar in the English language, something that you would take for granted. She's trying to get the reader to kind of really think through that process. And then we see here kind of something that resembles a passport. So again, maybe alluding to this question of traveling back to Korea, being exiled from Korea, having to get back, having to produce this documentation that should be a stable identity marker, but for Cha it ultimately isn't. And when Exilée was presented as a full kind of installation in a gallery, she had these slides. The text is a little bit hard to see, but this is a text that appears on these two images. This one says modified tense. Elsewhere, name, nom, birthday, date de naissance. So these slides would kind of flash throughout the exhibit, and when they're all presented to you on the same page, you can kind of look in and take all of it at once. But in the exhibition version of Exilée, these slides are all kind of flashing. They really force you to slow down and kind of like think about the word. It almost puts you in kind of like a trance of sorts, or maybe it makes you drowsy or something. So she is really kind of like making this process of reading very, very slow for the viewer of Exilée. And here's a selection from Temps Morts, so the other piece that she wrote. And one thing that I think is worth noting here is that she mentions to mysteries, to revelation, to Muse's 9 daughters, Mnemosyne. So Mnemosyne is the goddess of memory in classical Western mythology. And given Cha's interest in memory, it's no surprise that she references this particular figure. And I really think that this passage is very much looking forward to Dictée, because the book Dictée is structured around each of the 9 muses. They each get one chapter in Dictée, and then there's kind of one protagonist in Dictée that is associated with each muse. So we can see that there is this kind of idea of the muses and this goddess of memory being kind of very important for Cha, sort of like thematically. And here she also mentions this idea, the waters of Lethe, the waters of oblivion, drink oblivion of their former lives. O Father, is it possible that any can be so in love with life as to wish to leave these tranquil seats of the upper world, having had the remembrance of their former lives effectually washed away by Lethe? So this is a kind of roundabout reference to Virgil's Aeneid, so another kind of major classical piece. The protagonist Aeneas goes to the underworld with his dad, and they watch a lot of souls kind of gather at this mythological river Lethe, and at Lethe you drink this water and you forget your past lives, so you can be like reincarnated essentially. And what Cha does with this imagery is very interesting. So she kind of implies memoryless, imageless, incision to lift, incision to heal. So there's almost this kind of like healing effect from forgetting and being able to reconstruct your memory. And I also believe that this image makes its way into Dictée, maybe less kind of like with a sort of classical mythological slant, because the final 2 chapters of Dictée are very much structured around water imagery, and a sort of healing water is passed between a child figure and a sort of shamanistic kind of young woman figure to facilitate sort of a process of collective healing between the two. So I think this image is very important for Cha, and she remixes it in her final kind of draft of Dictée that we have today. So moving to Dictée itself, so this is Cha's first book, first like big actual book. And again, it's a very experimental text that is centered around 9 chapters named for the muses. And the narrators throughout Dictée can all be kind of collectively referred to as a diseuse. So this is like a professional French female reciter. And Dictée critically diverges from the rest of Cha's portfolio in kind of important ways. So again, her mentor and professor, Bertrand Aux, described Dictée as kind of deeply personal in a way that a lot of her other work was a little bit maybe disconnected from the figure of Cha herself. So Dictée references a lot of events that happened in Cha's life or things that were important to her. The text actually seems to begin at her high school. There is a Catholic mass and confession, so things that she would have been forced to do while in high school. I went to a Catholic high school myself, so I can confirm this. And one thing that is interesting about Dictée's personal references is that Dictée is often marketed as a classic work of autobiography, but I would say it is not quite straightforwardly that autobiographical in the way that you would expect a traditional memoir to be. Rather, I think a better way of understanding the autobiographical elements in Dictée is that for Cha, her family history and her personal life is just as interesting as the many other influences in her work, such as French theory, Tai Chi, Greek mythology, etc. So her personal life and her family's personal life gets weighted the same as these influences, which is a little bit unusual for someone kind of working in her mode. And that is how these autobiographical elements kind of drift into Dictée and almost become kind of part of this sort of collective unconscious memory that Cha is seeking to facilitate in her reader. And again, I would say that Dictée being a print book, so Cha herself is not really there to influence your reading of the work. It is an individual experience, you reading the book, right? Typically reading is something that we do by ourselves. And I think that Dictée, because it was very much intended to be a print piece from its inception, is really open to kind of Cha's sort of alchemical style, where it's open to partial readings, misreadings, etc. And my analysis of Dictée is very much steeped in my own personal training and my own interests. That's just one possible way to read this text. There are a number of avenues to understand Dictée if you're interested in approaching it later. And I would say that Dictée adapts very well all of these themes that appear throughout Cha's extant portfolio, particularly, again, thinking back to how much her film and book, White Dust from Mongolia, is grounded in Korean history, and specifically that group of Koreans who are living in Manchuria. So this is very much a major theme throughout Dictée. The process of learning a language is also problematized throughout Dictée through the French exercise of dictation. So when someone reads something aloud to you and you have to write it back on the paper, she parodies that in the opening of Dictée to make the reader kind of think more critically about this process, and language is deconstructed throughout the work, just like in a lot of her other earlier pieces. And again, mythology is another major concern throughout Dictée, and a way that she makes this book, in spite of all of its kind of competing influences in a sense, feel very, very cohesive. And again, this kind of concern with chronology or the passage of time recurs from White Dust to Mongolia, and the heroines overlap in a sense. So there are some parts where it feels like Cha or her mother are very much present in Dictée. So we can see kind of the influence from that previous piece reappearing in Dictée. So we can see here, this was the broadside used to advertise Dictée when it first came out. So she references the Muses here. And I think it's particularly provocative to think about Cha's own kind of interpretation of how she uses chronology in the book. She writes that Dictée experiments with time in which the characters experience in Korean history or mythological time. So these we think to be kind of separate from each other, but she's blending them all together. And she wants Dictée to be a sort of text that expands or condenses time or makes it constant or kind of feel eternal. So again, thinking back to her performance piece, Able Whale, the way it kind of creates this meditative space where it feels like you're suspended from the passing of normal time. This is something that Cha also sought to accomplish in Dictée. One particularly interesting avenue that I find for understanding Dictée overall is through ritual and religion. So literal, real-world rituals unite many of Cha's kind of core concerns with time, memory, etc. And if you think about it, when you practice a given kind of religious ritual, you're sort of suspended from the normal passage of time, right? You're kind of existing as you would sort of within this religious ritual, and then when you're done with it, only then does time kind of pass normally again. So she is using that in order to make this kind of meditative space in Dictée. Dictée itself is framed directly within the Catholic traditions of Mass and the Novena, so saying a prayer over a period of 9 days, and this thematically connects really well with Cha's use of the 9 Muses to frame the text. So you can kind of read each chapter as kind of connected but sort of independent from one another. They're all united by these general religious principles as a cohesive unit, but each chapter kind of has its own particular heroine with a set of individual interests. And Cha uses ritual elements from multiple traditions in order to facilitate a connection with the reader. So Roman Catholicism is a major one that appears in the beginning of Dictée, but towards the end of the text, she also leans very heavily into Greek mythology. We'll see the characters Demeter and Persephone from Pomegranate Offering recur in Dictée, and she is also interested in Korean shamanism. I think the figure of the shaman who is able to summon the voices of the dead and bring them back to life is something that very much resonates with Cha's idea of the artist as a sort of alchemist who is able to bring elements to life and facilitate a connection to the reader. So I think there's a lot of kind of generative movement between these two concepts, and that's why she leans heavily into it in Dictée. And my apologies for this restart message. I have to get rid of that. Well, this doesn't want to go away. Okay, we can just leave this here. My apologies for this technical interruption. So again, these influences are very resonant all throughout Dictée, and shamanism is almost very personal to Cha. So Cha's mother, Hyung Cha, again, told her children some stories of Korean shamanism growing up, particularly the story of Parigongju, who is considered to be the first shaman, an adaptation of the Parigongju myth, so where this young girl has to go to the underworld to get medicine for her dying parents, appears at the end of Dictée, adapted as healing water rather than this kind of long, arduous journey that she has to take and please an underworld god in the process. So one way we can see some of her earlier works operating in Dictée is through this chapter, Illiterate Lyric Poetry. This is a chapter that very heavily focuses on Demeter and Persephone especially, and we can see this selection from Pomegranate Offering where she's kind of doing this wordplay with the veil, revealing, arriving, etc., thinking about also this ritual of the Eleusinian mysteries in the classical past that is all thematized around kind of revealing the reunion of Demeter and Persephone and this knowledge that you could gain from the festival about how to live a happy afterlife. So we see this again in Illiterate Lyric Poetry, where she is kind of dragging out this meaning of the veil, the voile, the voile de mariée, and the shade, the screen, the door, what is behind the veil. So we can see that this wordplay is adapted into Dictée. A few years later, she's still kind of thinking about this theme and reusing it. And another point where we can see some of her earlier works readapted into Dictée are in the chapter Terpsichore, choral poetry. So we can see here that these are Cha's stage directions from Abel Whale, so instructions for her, the performer, and what to do. And we can see in the chapter Terpsichore choral poetry, there are directions almost for this protagonist. Don't move, not a sound, no sound, do not wait, kind of know when to move. And we can see that this chapter is kind of almost adapted in the same way as she would write kind of instructions for herself performing. So this chapter kind of encapsulates some elements of her earlier performance pieces. She's kind of reusing this stuff from earlier in her final work, Dictée. And finally, this chapter, Polymnia, Sacred Poetry, which is an adaptation of the Korean folktale Parigongju. We can see this is Cha's outfit from Abel Whale, the white robe with the headband, and there are two characters in Polymnia, Sacred Poetry. The first one is sort of a daughter figure, and we can see that her mother had given her a white kerchief to wear on her head, and a smock which was also white. This is very much resembling Cha's outfit that she has in Abel Whale, and there's a second female character who is also wearing a white kerchief and a white robe. So the two characters almost interlap with each other in the way or seem like the same person, kind of reflecting the intended plot of White Dust from Mongolia, right, where there's that second female character that helps the amnesiac female character regain her memories. They're almost kind of like the same person in a roundabout way, so we can not only see that theme coming through, but also the outfit that Cha wore is very, very similar to the outfit that the characters are described as wearing here, and we can maybe think that this performance piece is also sort of like an influence or kind of something that is consistent across her body of work. Because remember, this piece was performed in 1975, Dictée is published in 1982, so chronologically there's not really that much distance between Cha's earlier pieces and Dictée. They're all kind of like working together in a roundabout sort of way. So moving forward to the early reception of Dictée, which I think is a very interesting topic in and of itself, kind of just removed from the rest of Cha's work. So after Cha's Rape and Murder in 1982, her work kind of went very critically unattended, you could say. So there wasn't a lot of positive press for Dictée initially after its publication, and the book, you could say, was essentially forgotten about, mostly remembered by her family, and received one kind of like good review from an art critic at the time period, but otherwise it wasn't the kind of canonical text that we understand it as being today. This changes in 1994. In 1994, an anthology on Dictée titled Writing Self, Writing Nation was published by, I would say, some of the four kind of major scholars in Asian American studies, and particularly a major figures in a sort of feminist idea of Asian American studies. So these four names, Elaine Kim, Lisa Lau, Shelley Sun Wong, and Laura Hyun-Mi Kong, they contribute these essays that argue for the importance of Dictée as a sort of canonical text in Asian American studies and kind of what lessons Dictée's avant-garde approach offers. So despite Dictée being kind of like a Korean American text by virtue of Cha's background, initially some of these readers found this text very alienating because it didn't present the experience of being Korean American in a way that was straightforward to them. But in actuality, this is a very kind of strong approach that Cha has offered for this problem of Asian American representation, because through Dictée she demonstrates that you don't need to resort to kind of like a documentary method where the audience like necessarily needs to find every single thing about you in order to understand you, or a method that sort of could lean into stereotyping in order to represent the Asian American experience, to make a little divergence into the history of Asian American literature. One canonical text that suffers this problem is Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior, which is considered one of the foundational pieces of Asian American literature, but has also attracted a lot of criticism for what its critics believe to be engaging kind of in stereotyping through some of the stories that she uses in the narrative. And Cha avoids this problem through her experimental approach entirely. And this led to the canonization, you could say, of Dictée as a foundational piece in Asian American studies and really established Cha's revival kind of like as an author to be reckoned with and as an artist as well. It's also worth mentioning that Lisa Lau's essay in Writing Self, Writing Nation became kind of the foundational piece for her book Immigrant Acts, which is also considered kind of a foundational text in Asian American studies that everyone has to read at some point. So Cha gains this like very kind of important stance in this discipline, if you will. And the popularity of Dictée stemming from Writing Self, Writing Nation eventually leads to interest in a Korean translation of Dictée, and this is another kind of interesting path in and of itself. The Korean translation of Dictée is published by Tomato Press in 1997 by Kyungnam Kim Richards, who was a Korean lecturer at Berkeley and a friend of Cha's mother, Hyung-Soon Cha, and they worked kind of collaboratively to make this translation of Dictée, it seems. And along with the Korean translation of Dictée, Cha's mother also published a piece called 내가 뜨거운 작은 흑점, or The Little Black Spot I Left Behind, also in 1997, and it seems that these two pieces were intended to be kind of companions to each other. They're published by the same press and they're promoted at the same time. Hyung-Soon Cha goes back to Korea to promote the book. And later in 2016, John Cha, Theresa's eldest brother, publishes a memoir titled Annyeong Theresa. Annyeong can be either hello or goodbye. It's probably farewell, kind of given the context of the book. And Annyeong Theresa covers the criminal trial for Theresa's rape and murder and the kind of misfortunes that the family suffered. It was a very long, drawn-out process for them, but it also features snippets of Theresa kind of like as a person. So a lot of academic writing on Theresa is mostly interested kind of in Dictée and sort of less like who is Theresa, like what was she like. And this is something that Farewell Theresa kind of seeks to remedy in a lot of ways. It presents kind of a more holistic picture of her as a person. And one interesting tidbit about this text is that John initially wrote it in English, which is the language he seems more comfortable with, got someone else to translate it into Korean, and now he is still trying to translate it from Korean back into English, so we're not sure when this will come out, but hopefully it will shortly. And we can see here the pieces that the Cha family has worked on. So on the left here is the tribute in honor of Theresa Hak Kyung Cha, and this is a series of poems and other creative pieces collected by the family, all written by Cha's friends. A very provocative read, but one that is quite hard to find, and it features a lot of the family's own writing, so kind of showing you their creative depth of sorts and how they're all artistic kind of together. In the middle here is Kyung Cha's book, 내가 뜨거운 작은 흑점, and you may notice here there is a railroad, so kind of the star piece of this text is an autobiographical essay where she writes about the experience of leaving her brother behind in North Korea as she's fleeing south. She takes a train and he kind of becomes a small dot. It's the piece that kind of sets the tone for the rest of the essays. And all of these essays kind of cover some element of Kyung Cha's life. And what is interesting about The Little Black Spot I Left Behind is that it is kind of framed and thematized around the same themes that her daughter is interested in Dictée, so kind of like memory, language, the self, so on and so forth. So all of these are autobiographical essays that kind of deal with some of the topics her daughter has written, and she also writes about the dreams she has about her daughter after her passing. It's a very moving read, but one that is quite hard to find outside of Korea. And then the final text we have here is John Cha's Angyong Theresa, and the cover image for the text is based on one of Theresa's performance pieces, so again a nice kind of reference to his sister, keeping her memory alive in this sort of way. One other thing I should also mention too is that this image of Kyung Cha on the front of The Little Black Spot I Left Behind is the same image of her that appears in Dictée, so there is a kind of thematic connection that's being made between the two texts just right from the start on the book cover, so they're kind of intended to be sort of companion pieces in a way. And moving forward, so there is a whole period of kind of what I would dub as Cha and Dictée's later reception, and it begins in 2020 with the publication of Cathy Park Hong's book, Minor Feelings. So some of you may have heard of Minor Feelings before. This text is all about this phenomenon that Cathy Park Hong calls minor feelings, or kind of like these moments where, as Asian Americans, it feels like very difficult to speak out about the particularities of the Asian American condition, or just kind of watching injustices happen to your people without being able to really speak out about it, these kind of self-defeating feelings. And each chapter of Minor Feelings deals with a situation in which Hong kind of finds herself engaging with these kind of negative feelings and how she seeks to kind of deal with them. And one of the chapters is all about Cha, Dictée, and Cha's traumatic death. And in this chapter, Hong writes that not enough people have really talked about Theresa Cha's death. It feels like a lot of people have glossed over it and tried to forget what happened, but it's important to remember what happened so it doesn't, like, happen again, right? And this chapter of Minor Feelings really sparked a wide mainstream revival of Cha that had been kind of unprecedented until this time period. So prior to Minor Feelings, Cha is always a popular figure in academia, I would say. Many people who are academics have heard of her before or are familiar with Dictée, etc. But Minor Feelings really did a lot of work to bring Dictée to a general audience. So thinking about its publication date, it's published in 2020, right? Lockdown happens, a lot of people have spare time to read. This book becomes massively popular, and the chapter on Cha is one of the highlights of the book, you could say. So a lot of people are very interested in Dictée after Minor Feelings, and Dictée got republished in 2022 directly as a result of Minor Feelings, in addition to a collection titled Exilée, Temps Morts, featuring those two pieces I discussed earlier and some of Cha's unpublished work. The earlier version of Exilée, Temps Morts was difficult to find before its reprinting in 2022. So Cathy Park Hong kind of single-handedly has done a lot of good for Cha's reception, but it's a little bit of a double-edged sword because in Minor Feelings, she thinks that academics haven't done enough to help Cha's image or discuss Cha's death sufficiently, and this has caused a little bit of controversy among other Cha scholars who argue that our writing was what helped to keep Cha a canonical figure in Asian American studies. This is doing us too much of a disservice, so there's a little bit of a controversy between these two kind of opposing camps right now that is still playing out kind of actively in real time right now. People are writing about this, and that is kind of the new direction that Cha scholarship is kind of going in. So Poe's Minor Feelings as well. Cha's work was featured in the 2022 Whitney Biennial, Quiet as It's Kept, for the first time since 1993. So this is a really big moment for Cha. She is at this big artistic festival, again, getting more people to be interested in her life and work. And in the early 2026, there will be the first ever major retrospective of Cha's work, featuring things that have never been in a museum before or gallery setting at the Berkeley Pacific Art and Film Archive, so where Cha worked for a lot of her life and where Cha's archive is currently kept today. So thank you for my presentation. I apologize for the technical difficulties, but I hope that this was an engaging and intellectually generative presentation. Thank you.
So let's have a few questions to the speaker. Question?
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that she's had an impact on more contemporary and maybe like well-known Asian American writers right now, like you mentioned Ocean Vuong,
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are familiar with.
Yes.
Could you talk about that a little bit more?
Yes, so a lot of these writers, they're well educated and they go to their college classes, they take like Asian American literature, and Theresa Cha is kind of like a formative author for a lot of these later writers. They don't know quite how to like express themselves or their experiences in ways that feel kind of like resonant for them. And Theresa Cha is like this very generative figure who shows you a way that you can kind of be more abstract in the way that you present yourself, or kind of like you're able to combine all of your disparate interests together in order to fully express yourself, things that may seem separate from one another. So actually taking the figure of Ocean Vuong, because me, him, and Theresa Cha kind of all have this in common. So I'm a classicist by training, right? I work in Greek and Latin. And because I am Korean American, initially I was thinking there is a conflict between my identity and the field of study I've chosen, which is essentially like the field of dead white men, right? So I experienced this kind of disconnect between what I felt was my identity and kind of like my professional life. And then I read Dictée as an undergraduate, and I was like, oh, these things don't have to be separate from one another. You can use these themes to talk generatively about your past experiences, or they don't have to necessarily be opposed to one another in this kind of way. And Ocean Vuong takes this up too, because in his first poetry collection, if you are familiar with it, he brings up the Odyssey a lot, and specifically the figure of Telemachus he kind of uses to talk about himself in a way, so kind of like the unruly son figure from the Odyssey who's trying to figure himself out relative to his absent father. So Theresa Cha is really kind of like this mode that shows you can kind of use these Western things that seem kind of like distant or unfamiliar from your personal identity in order to kind of like express yourself more strongly. And I think that's why she's such a generative figure for all of these poets who are Asian American but grow up in this environment where they are constantly exposed to kind of like Western literature and have to figure out how to make do with that. So I think that is why she's a particularly generative figure. Not to mention that her experimental style shows that you can really kind of like do whatever you want in a way, and that's very freeing. She has so many interests that she is able to unite in her print work, so she is very generative for not just poets but also other conceptual artists as well. It's just that I'm kind of less familiar with that domain specifically, but yeah, she's very influential all around.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Any other?
Yeah, I'm not, fan of, art, but it's, only I'm thinking about the collective memory. But her own works is not like the time flow. It's sort of the collective work. But could you elaborate how the characters and Exilée?
Exilée, yeah.
Yeah. Expand upon what diverged from the theme explored in details.
Yes. So the themes from Exilée and how they're connected to Dictée, is that?
Yeah.
So I think there are two sections of Dictée that really are quite concerned with the same themes. I didn't go into a ton of detail about Dictée given the time constraints of this presentation. But the two chapters that I think are best connected are Calliope Epic Poetry, which is a chapter about Cha's mother, and Melpomene, tragedy. So at the end of Calliope epic poetry, there is this sequence where a young woman is trying to go back to her home country. I believe it's Korea, but don't remember 100% off the top of my head. And she kind of has like a mental breakdown at passport control, basically, where she's sort of like, you know, I technically belong to this country, but really I'm kind of from another country, and this isn't really what my experience reflects, and I kind of feel very disoriented from everything right now. So I think the concerns of Exilée are reflected in that particular section of Dictée, especially as they pertain to the passport right, which is this key image that appears in Exilée, and is kind of like shown throughout several slides in the exhibition, so you know it's important to Cha, right? So that theme appears there as well. And then in the chapter Melpomene Tragedy in Dictée, Cha writes about her experience kind of coming back to Korea to a figure that is her mother, so probably Hong Soon Cha, and how alienating it is to come back to Korea after all this time and see that, you know, things are sort of different or have stayed the same in ways that Cha doesn't necessarily expect. So I think those are the two chapters where the themes from Exilée kind of reappear in Dictée. And then in general, Cha's deconstruction of language and interest in French from Exilée also recurs in Dictée. And one chapter where that is particularly prominent is Urania Astronomy, which is kind of a very abstract poem that sort of is interspersed between English and French and features Cha kind of disconnecting or translating or mistranslating words between English and French, which is something that we also get in Exilée, especially in some other parts of that work that I did not present to you guys today. She takes the word Exilée and then kind of deconstructs it, so some similar work is going on there. And that's kind of how that piece sort of overlaps with Dictée, especially as it pertains to, oh, you know, like I have the passports, but I don't really feel like, you know, one of them, in sort of a roundabout kind of way. Yeah.
So this book, Dictée, is actually translated in Korean and published in Korea last year.
Yes.
So I wonder how was received in Korean literature world, and I know not many Koreans read this book, so do you know anything about
Yes, I actually do know a fair amount about this, coincidentally. So the kind of major figure behind Dictée's sort of popularity in Korea, and the person who has done kind of the most academic work on the reception of Asian American literature in Korea is Kyung Lee. I think he's a retired professor now. I forget where he worked, but I feel like it's Seoul University, but I'm not sure, in like their English department, something like that. He's in an English department. And Kyung Lee was also the person kind of promoting the translation, the Korean translation of Dictée for the first time in 1997. So he's this kind of very important figure who's sort of like helping to promote this translation of Dictée in Korea. And he writes in some of his work on Asian American literature's reception in Korea that overall it's kind of like a niche field, right? It's something that's very academic. It's not something that kind of like a lot of, you know, you could say kind of average everyday people are doing. But within the selection of Korean language articles about Asian American literature, Dictée is one of the most popular pieces to write about, probably because Cha herself is Korean American, so there's kind of like a connection between the two in a way. And this is probably one of the most popular Asian American pieces that academic, Korean language academics are working on, so it's kind of popular within that very hyper-specific sphere. And then one other interesting point about Dictée's reception in Korea is that even though Dictée itself is not necessarily the most popular book in Korea, the Korean language audience is more interested generally, I would say, in directly interfacing with Cha's family than American publishers or English language academics working with Dictée. Korean language publishers are very keen to collaborate directly with the Cha family, so we see this in 내가 두고 온 작품 흑점. This is published by a Korean press. It has never been translated into English, and there's generally kind of little interest among English language academics about this book, even though you could say Cha's mother is kind of like the protagonist of Dictée in a lot of ways, so you know there's kind of like an obvious connection between these two pieces that's worth looking at in more detail. So this is one way in which the Korean language audience, though small, has had kind of like an outsized impact on Dictée. And additionally, Cha's brother, John Cha, collaborates frequently with Korean publishers and Korean writers. So again, you know, his memoir, even though he wrote it in English, it's published in Korea first. He thinks that there is more interest in Korea there rather than in America, in spite of Cha's kind of big English language reception. And additionally, John Cha has also contributed to a book whose Korean title I forget, but it's called, roughly translated, Theory of Art, Cha Hak Kyung or something like that. So he writes a little chapter on knowing Theresa for that book that is also published in Korea, hasn't received a translation in the States. And then in the most recent 2024 Korean publication of Dictée, released in December 2024, so very recently, John Cha gets like an entire chapter at the end where he talks about kind of like Theresa's life, the influence that she had on him, and also the relationship between Theresa Cha and her mother, and how elements that appear in 내가 두고 온 작은 흑점, Theresa's mother's book, also appear in Dictée, and how there's kind of like a connection between the two. So the Korean reception of Dictée is very interesting and I think understudied. There is one particularly good article about this, I would say, and it is it's something like Theresa Cha or Cha Hak Kyung, something like that, and it is by Jennifer Kyung Lee. So if you are interested in reading about the Korean reception of Dictée, I would recommend that piece. Yeah.
Tom?
Thank you for your presentation today. The one thing that stands out to me in your presentation is the true passion that you have for your subject matter. You are a trained classicist,
Yes.
and in that field you are a very analytical person when it comes to literature.
Yes, I would say.
Dictée is Theresa's magnum opus.
Yes.
A life cut short, unfortunately. Too bad we haven't seen anything beyond Dictée. And that was the first thing you read of hers.
Yes.
You dove into the deep end of the pool,
Yes, essentially.
and then you explored all of the territory, the entire pool, if you will, extend the metaphor. I suspect that Dictée really touched your soul, and you made an identification with this author and her very complicated sojourn in her short life.
Yeah, so
What was that experience like for
yes.
you?
So actually this is a very common phenomenon among people who work with Cha and kind of like the draw sort of her pieces, even though a lot of people who work on Cha don't kind of have the full academic training to kind of fully get every single nuance of her work because it is just too much to cover, right? Like you have to have good command of French, film theory, classics, blah, 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 etc., complet, whatever. And I think what really drew me to Cha was just the way that she was able to use classical references kind of so seamlessly in her work, because in my field, some of her readings were not discovered until kind of very much kind of later on. Cha is one of the first people who does this very feminist reading of the myth, the Homeric Demeter, really emphasizing the reunification between the daughter and the mother. And this is something that is very innovative. A lot of adaptations of that particular piece focus more on kind of like the relationship between Hades and Persephone rather than Demeter and Persephone. So this is just something that I found really interesting. And I also think there is kind of a unique angle coming to Cha's archive as a classicist, because like many of the figures I study, she is kind of like dead on arrival, right? She is not someone who's currently active. Her entire archive is kind of cut short. And additionally, Cha is someone who is also very interested in the process of language and grammar. So our approach that we learn in classics is called philological. It's very much focused kind of on the intricacies of language and really hyper-analyzing like grammar specifically. So that approach is very generative when working with an archive like Theresa Cha's, where she's also very much focused on the process of language, kind of thinking about passive-active voice, drawing out the subject, the object, whatever. So this kind of approach that I've learned studying Latin and Greek is also relevant when analyzing Dictée kind of like as a literary text of sorts. So I think that's my personal connection to it, but a lot of people have kind of deeply personal connections to Cha in a way that I think somebody kind of needs to write more about this phenomenon in detail, because it's actually quite common with creatives who work on Cha to have this almost kind of like devotion to her in a roundabout way. And there is one person who has published a recent piece kind of talking about this phenomenon, Josephine Hockney Park. So she is an English professor, I believe. And I believe the piece is called Theresa Cha in Black and White, and it talks about this kind of recent phenomenon of really being drawn to Cha almost as like a sort of martyr in a sense because of the nature of her early death and the interests reflected in her work, and she kind of talks a little bit about the psychological aspects of being drawn to Cha in a sort of sense. And I think that is one direction where Cha's reception does need kind of further analysis and study, because it is something that a lot of people kind of fall into. And one kind of like alarming direction I would say that almost kind of happens in is people kind of identifying as Cha herself is also something that comes up in works about Cha. I personally prefer to remain a little bit distant from Cha herself. You know, we are two different people, kind of on two different academic journeys, but it is an interesting phenomenon that you see with Cha that I feel like you don't necessarily see with other contemporary Asian American writers because they're all still alive, right? So that is a particularly interesting direction that I believe her reception has kind of specifically. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you for the great presentation. And my hunch is that the book Dictée is really, difficult book to grasp all the meanings and symbols.
Yes, it is.
So for the ordinary, readers, at least how many times do you recommend that readers to read that book?
Yeah. So I say you.
I have a second question.
Yes.
So, what was your feeling or your shock when you first met this book?
Yes.
Yeah, that's my second question.
Yes. So to answer your first question, so for the average reader, what I think is Dictée is kind of like a weird piece because the language is deceptively simple because it's kind of reflecting this reality of I'm Theresa Cha, I have to learn English, like what do I do? So the language is very simple in some parts, but then it feels kind of very complicated in a way because it's so abstract. I think the sort of easiest way to understand Dictée is to think about it sort of like almost as Cha intended, but kind of in the veins of, not to make another roundabout reference, but the Catholic mysteries of the Rosary. So if you're not familiar with that, it's a prayer that Catholics do. So she's Catholic, right? This is relevant. And the mysteries of the Rosary all feature kind of different anecdotes from the life of Jesus that are all kind of loosely connected to one another. I think Dictée is very much like this. It's a series of narratives that are all kind of loosely connected to one another, particularly through an interest either in history, how we tell history, who gets to tell history, how is history retold, etc., and through kind of like forming language or kind of like miscommunication. So I think it takes kind of several reads to kind of like fully get it, but I also think, again, there's kind of no right or wrong way to read Dictée. You can just spend some time with it. You can spend a lot of time with one chapter, not really get another chapter, read half of the book, put it down, read it again later, etc. That seems to be what Cha kind of would have wanted for this book in terms of her artistic style. And then the second question as to how I reacted to Dictée. So I learned about Dictée actually randomly at like a mentorship meeting for Asian Americans in classical studies because there's not a lot of us. This book came up during our first meeting and the other two people in my mentorship group kept talking about it and I was like, what is this book? I've never heard of it, I have to read it. So then I read the book and I was like, wow, this book is awesome. So that's how I kind of fell into this Dictée rabbit hole in a roundabout way. And I think Cha is just a very interesting artistic figure. So again, that was kind of a lot of the allure of Cha for me was that she's this, my family's background is that we were kind of like North Korean, fled south, so there's kind of some similarity there, and I think that kind of made me interested in her. Also, coincidentally, we went to the same kind of specific Catholic high school, a Sacred Heart high school, and there's a lot of specific traditions at Sacred Heart high schools that Cha kind of alludes to in Dictée, and I had never seen someone actually kind of talk about it like that before, so I was like, that's cool. So you could say it was like a personal connection, and you could say, maybe her artistic approach is successful, she found some elements, and, we forged some kind of connection between myself and her work, right? So that's how I fell into it, yeah.
Thank you for your presentation, like everybody. I haven't heard about the Cha until now, so it was a good time for me. And my question is, I'm not French, but I think the Dictée, the title is French,
yes.
right? And
yeah.
the meaning of Dictée is dictation?
Yes.
Right,
Yeah.
so my question is, why do you think the author title the book as Dictée?
Yes.
I mean, dictation is teacher say something
Yes.
and we write, right?
Yes.
So do you think it's because of past and present is connect each other, like my mom's life and my life is connect each other? That's why she called the book Dictée, or I don't know.
Yeah.
I wish I read the book and I related the book to the title because I haven't read the book, so yeah.
Yes, so the title of this book, that's one element of it, right? Like Cha's mother tells Theresa Cha her life and appears in Dictée, so it's one element going on. Additionally, Cha seems to have been kind of literally forced to do Dictée at her high school. The first kind of unlabeled section of Dictée, I said it's in 9 chapters. It's a little bit disingenuous. There's kind of like a first part and then a second part that is kind of unlabeled that really sets the tone for the beginning and the ending of the book. The beginning of Dictée is almost kind of like set in what very much resembles Cha's high school, but we're not told explicitly. And in that section of the book, the narrator is forced to perform Dictée and is literally kind of doing a dictée where someone is dictating and she's kind of writing out the sentence, but she does it incorrectly. So when you normally do dictée, you just write the word and you don't write any of the grammatical markers. But Cha's narrator, who is doing dictée, is like, it was the first day, comma, and I felt good, period. Like literally writing out the punctuation and kind of improperly performing the dictée. And that really sets the tone, first of all, for Cha's kind of interest in language generally, the narrator who is kind of like producing this sort of incorrect language in a way, but also kind of setting the tone for repetition and kind of like reproduction and almost kind of like the counterfeit as it appears in Dictée, because Cha sources a number of images and quotations without actually giving references for any of them, and is kind of parodying almost the process of kind of Dictée like we see in the opening kind of throughout the book repeatedly. So the title is very important. It foreshadows kind of Cha's sort of like artistic method in Dictée kind of throughout the work. And it's very much kind of connected to the actual operations of the book. So your observation, why is it called Dictée, is a very astute one. And I just like did not have the kind of scope to include all of those portions of Dictée kind of within the context of this presentation. Thank you.
Somewhat related questions.
Mm-hmm.
There's the female features, including her own mother, like the Yu Guan-sun and Joan of Arc.
Yes.
So how do they relate with the her personal narrative?
Yes. So all of these figures are ones that Cha has kind of like taken a personal interest in. Her mom is really obvious. Joan of Arc, she is really into a French film that features Joan of Arc. There are stills from this French film that appear reproduced in Dictée and also in Apparatus as well. So she's interested, I think, in Joan of Arc not only as a particular saintly Catholic figure, but also her representation in this specific French film that deals with her. And Yu Guan-sun, it is believed, and I don't remember where I read this, that Cha watched a movie as a kid that featured Yu Guan-sun, so she was kind of like obsessed with her in that respect. But I also think, thinking about the archive that Cha built to construct Dictée, that Yu Guan-sun has a lot of resonance with Joan of Arc specifically, and kind of like these other young female figures that appear in Cha's work. And Cha is also kind of concerned with the reception of Yu Guan-sun. Her retelling of Yu Guan-sun really kind of emphasizes her independence and her kind of like bravery, whereas I believe in certain official histories featuring Yu Guan-sun, her kind of importance or role in Korean independence is sort of like dismissed a little bit, like, oh, she's just like kind of a young girl, she was like a one-time thing. But Cha really emphasizes kind of like her agency and her bravery. So I also think there is this kind of interest in the retelling of history in terms of the figure of Yu Guan-sun appearing in Dictée. And she appears in the first chapter, Cleo History. She's like kind of the protagonist of that chapter, if you will, so she's quite important. But I think all the figures are kind of connected through this shared thread of being kind of like martyrs in a sense, or Cha herself is personally interested in them and wanted to spend kind of more time thinking about and dissecting these figures. So there's kind of some personal connection between her and a lot of the figures that appear in Dictée.
Last question from Sam.
although I'm not even close to scratching the surface, to understand this topic, I am. It was a very interesting presentation, and I'm absolutely intrigued. And I cannot imagine. You mentioned that Dictée was translated into Korean language. I cannot imagine how that could be done. I mean,
Yeah,
it would
it's
not
hard.
be translated.
It's
It would be like
Yes.
interpretation and explanation.
Yes.
Theresa Cha would be the only person who can write that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and I don't know how that's going to be possible in Korean language, from there. At any rate, but my impression is that it seems to depict the depressive memories of her mother country and her family and personal difficulties, experience. And if she were living, I mean, this may not be your job, it's in your area of study, analysis, but, I think I can make it personal. If she were living today in the 21st century, how Korea has, where it has come, how would that Dictée be written, the edition 21st century of Dictée?
Yeah.
Or if you were to write it, how would you write it?
Oh.
That's sort of occurred to my mind. Yeah,
I really don't know.
Yeah.
If I were to
it's
rewrite
gonna
that.
be, there's going to be the impression is this very abstract but a little dark. But would it be like a delight? There's some dark side, but also like a delight and dancing.
It's also graphical.
Yes, it's very
And
graphical.
to do the transposing into another language of something that's so graphical,
Yeah.
that's a major task.
Yeah. I think if I were to remake Dictée now, I would want to do it as a series of kind of abstract
Yeah.
tube videos or something like that. So kind of using the, Theresa Cha doesn't have any of these internet mediums that we're familiar with today, but those are things that she can work with. I think something like doing something with an internet medium or kind of there is this idea from the art theorist Hito Serral, I think is how you say her name, of sort of the bad image or the blurry image, where it's an image that has been circulated around so often that it's no longer kind of itself, it's the bad copy. I think using something like the bad copy is kind of how I would make Dictée today if I were able to. And then regarding your first question about how to translate it into Korean, so one thing that's worth noting about the first Korean translation of Dictée is that it has an entire kind of author's note at the end where the translator explains a lot of her decisions and understanding of Dictée and kind of general explanation of it for Korean audiences. And while she was writing on it, the scholarship on Dictée was kind of so sparse at the time that there were 2 undergraduate senior theses that are cited in the first Korean translation of Dictée, which is really kind of an interesting fact given how popular Dictée is among academics now. You would not really catch anyone citing an undergrad senior thesis in order to analyze Dictée. I will say one of those theses is very interesting because this individual got access to kind of the Cha family directly prior to Dictée's critical revival in 1994, got to see Theresa Cha's entire archive, and got to interview everyone that she interacted with. So I guess that, that it makes sense why that one is in there, but I haven't read the other one. And additionally, there are footnotes in the Korean translation of Dictée that don't appear in the English version, and the glossary that appears with the footnotes is very, very long. So if you get your hands on a Korean translation of Dictée, you can see how much work the translator really put into it.
Okay. Great presentation today. We're so blessed to have Elisa today. And next time, we'd like to have Professor Elisa McAtee.
I don't know if that's
Okay. So she has 3 more years at UCLA. So wish you the best for your study.
Will this become the subject of your dissertation?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm walking.
Okay, so thank you for joining us today. We learned a lot about Theresa Cha.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, great.